this stylish shoulder bag was made from only 4 fat quarters of fabric, and even then I had a little bit left over. It's really simple to make, although I think it looks quite complicated. I put one patch pocket on the front. There's plenty of fabric left if you wanted to add another one to the back, or even put some pockets on the inside as well. So if you'd like to make it, here's how we do it. The first thing to do is to cut your fat quarters in half. So you'll take your 2 main fat quarters, one for the outside of the bag and one for the lining, trim away any selvage that may happen to be on the fat quarters, and then cut them in half. So you'll have 4 rectangles, 2 for the front and 2 for the lining, that measure approximately 17.5 inches by around about 10.5 inches. From the bottom corner of each one of those pieces, we're going to cut away a 1-inch box, and this is what's going to make your bag base square. So do that to the 2 outer pieces and the 2 lining pieces. And on the outer pieces, I've put some fusible fleece on the wrong side. So that's a self-adhesive polyester wadding, which is going to give my bag a little bit of firmness. It makes it a little bit more sturdy. I have 2 channels that go on the front and the back of the bag. So this is from fat quarter number 3, and I cut 2 strips of fabric that measure 15 inches in length by 2 inches in width. Fold the edges over by 1/4 inch and press here, and then fold the ends over by 1/2 inch each and press those. So you'll need 2 of those, and that's what makes the channel, which houses the cord. And this is just 1/4 inch piping cord. You could use ribbon if you wanted to, and this measures about 25 inches in length. I may need to cut that down later on. Better to be too long than too short, because I can always cut a long cord shorter. I can't make a short one longer. We have a pocket that goes on the front of the bag, and that is made from a strip of fabric. This is fat quarter number 3 still, which is cut to 12 inches in length by 6 inches in width. And your final cutting is going to be for the handles, and you will need 2 pieces of fabric which measure the width of your fat quarter, so 22 inches in length and 4 inches wide. So that's all the cutting that you need to do. Let's get on with the making. So first of all, with your handles, you need 2 of these. Fold the whole piece of fabric in half and press, and then fold the long edges to the centre, press again, and then fold the whole thing in half again and press. If you wanted to make the handles a little bit firmer, you can use some spray starch. Now sew down either side, just top stitch on both pieces. Don't worry about sewing over the ends, because these are going to be within the seam allowance. So when you've finished that, you will have 2 handles that look a little bit, like this. And then we'll put those to one side. To make up the pocket, you take your 6 by 12 piece of fabric and fold it in half. Then you're going to sew down either side and across the bottom, but leave a turning gap in the bottom of around about 2 inches. Snip off the very corners, but not through the seams. Turn the whole thing the right side out and press, and you'll have a pocket that looks like this. I've top stitched across the top because it makes it look neat, and I've left the turning gap open at the bottom, because when this goes onto the front of the bag, that's when I'm going to sew across the top as it's applied. So let's start to put this together. So first of all, I'm taking the outer part of my bag, and I'll need to position the channel for the cord to go through. So I'm going to put mine 2 inches from the top of my bag. So measure and mark this to make it accurate, and just make sure that that channel is sitting evenly either side here. So just line up my ruler and make sure that's central. I'm going to place my cord underneath there, because it's easier to do it this way than it is to try and sew the cord through. And we'll have a couple of pins in there just to hold it in place. And then we'll sew along either side of that channel. Now at the end of the channel, I'm going to go backwards and forwards a few times just to make my seam stronger, because if there is any strain on the seam, then this is where it's going to be. Let's just tuck those ends in to make neat. I am going to move the needle across on my sewing machine. On most sewing machines, if you have a straight stitch, there's no width to a straight stitch, but if you use the straight stitch width button, it'll move the needle from one side to the other. So without putting a zipper foot on my machine, I can get really close to where I need to be. So keep that nice and straight. Reverse stitch at the end again, snip, and that's how we're looking. So turn your work over, make sure you're not sewing through that cord, so keep it out of the way, and do the same on the other side. I can still move that cord if it's getting a little bit too close to my stitches. And remember to back tack. In other words, sew backwards and forwards for a few stitches before you snip your thread. So that's now sewn in place. Now I'm going to place the pocket slightly over the top, so I can still see the cord behind there. Let's measure this to make sure it's sitting in the centre and that it's square. So I'm just going to secure that pocket with a couple of pins, and I'll show you how we sew. Now this time I'm not just going to sew around the pocket, I'm going to start my stitch line from up here, so I'm actually sewing through the cord, because when I gather the cord and I tie it at the sides here, I don't want it to crinkle up around the pocket, I just want it to gather onto these two pieces. So by sewing across the cord, that stops that bit in the centre from gathering. And just like before, always when you start sewing, if you've got a lock stitch on your machine, that's fine. That's a stitch that will put 3 or 4 stitches on top of each other. Otherwise, just sew a couple of stitches backwards to strengthen your seam. When you come into the corner, leave the needle in the down position. Some sewing machines will automatically do that. Some you will have to turn the hand wheel. But that just means every time you start sewing, you're going to carry on that straight line of stitches from where you left off. So that's how we're looking now. So let's take the pins out. So again, we've got a nice deep pocket on the front, which is going to be useful. And when I pull together, it's only going to gather those very side bits, but that's for the end. For the second half of the bag, I've done exactly the same with the channel, but the back of the bag hasn't got a pocket on it. So instead of putting the pocket over, I've put the channel on in the same position as I have on the front of the bag, and this time I've just sewn over at the same distance as I have on the front, so if there were a pocket, it would sit either side of those two sew lines. You could put another pocket on the back if you wanted to. You could add more pockets on the inside if you wanted to. Right, let's start putting this thing together. So, you get out of the way. We're going to put the handles on first of all. So again, measure them so they are equidistant from either side. Facing downwards. So I'm going to actually, let's line these up with the pockets on the front of the bag, because that will make it look nice and neat, and I know they're central. So facing downwards, line up to the edge of your pocket and pin, and do the same with the other one. Make sure your handle is not twisted as it comes around. Line up and pin. And then we'll do the same with the opposite side of the bag, and we need them in exactly the same place, so I'm just going to measure and mark against the side that I've just done. So again, facing downwards, make sure they're not twisted, in the same position and pin, and the final one here. You could add some applique if you wanted to the pocket on the front of the bag. Do that before you start sewing the pocket together, otherwise you won't be able to get inside it. You could make the handles longer or shorter, or even use shop bought handles if you prefer to. So I'm giving you the basics, if you like, of how to make this bag, but then if you wanted to adapt it and make it personal, it's entirely up to you. So I'm just going to sew across the ends of the handles purely so I can remove the pins. So within the seam allowance. So I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So inside that 1/4 inch seam allowance, because I don't want to see those when we turn it the right side out. And the same with the opposite side of the bag. Don't sew over your pins. Probably won't do any damage to the pins if you sew over them. You may break a needle if you hit a pin with your sewing machine. The worst thing that can happen is that your pin will break in half and fly off somewhere, because you never know where it's going to land. Right, we're going to sew the top of the lining to the top of the bag on both pieces. Now you can pin if you want to. I find it quicker not to, so just line up the two edges of the fabric like so. Come here. And sew straight across. So you can feel when you're going over the handles, because you'll have quite a thickness of fabric to sew through there. And in fact, a little tip for you. You may want to put a denim needle into your sewing machine. A denim needle is a stronger needle than your average, so it's been designed to go through thicker weights of fabric. You might find it a bit easier. So again, with the opposite side of the bag, line up those raw edges and sew over the handles. And down to the end. Okay. Open up the two sides, lay your pieces right sides together, and we're going to sew all the way around, apart from those cut out corners, and leaving a turning gap of about 4 or 5 inches, no need to measure, in the bottom of the bag. The important bit here is the seams on the ends, on the top of the bag. I want those to be matched. So I'm going to put a pin in either side. I know I say it all the time, but if your seams match perfectly, nobody will notice. They notice when they don't. Right, and that's actually so important. That's where I'm going to start sewing. When you come to the when you come to the cord, make sure these cords are tucked right out of the way. We don't want to sew over them. So those go right inside the bag like so, and then we'll sew. Move those handles out of the way as well, because we don't want to sew over those either. When I was saying about sewing backwards and forwards on the start of your seam, not too worried in these cases, because immediately I finish, I'm going to make another seam across the ends of these anyway. Tuck your cord out of the way, and sew. Here's my pin. Now this is the side where I'm going to leave a gap in the bottom. About here. So again, sew backwards and then forwards a couple of times, and then carry on. Move those straps out of the way. And then we're back to the beginning. Now remember where I left the cut out corners? What I'm going to do now is to squish the corners open, so I'll put my fingers inside them and flatten them together. So the two seams are sitting on top of each other, and I'm going to sew straight across. And do this on all four corners. So squish it open, seams sitting together. You can push the seams in opposite directions to make it a little less bulky as you sew across them. And then the same in the lining. So straight across here. And the final corner here. Right. Now we're going to turn the whole thing the right side out. There we go. Push out those corners so you can see how I've made the base square. And on this side. And then here's the lining base. And again on this side. So now I've got a hole in my lining, I'll need to sew that closed. So normally I'd use the same colour thread, but just for speed's sake I'll use the white that I have in there. Pull the two sides of your hole open and squish them together, and you'll find that the edge of the fabric automatically folds in. And then we'll just sew straight across. Almost finished. Here we go. So now we're going to push the lining inside the bag. I would press that so the seam sits on the top. And then if you have a free arm on your sewing machine, you can top stitch around there. I don't have a free arm on my sewing machine, so I'm just going to be careful. Right, so I'm folding the fabric as I go and just trying to get the seam to sit right on the top. I like top stitching. I think it gives a really professional finish to your bag, or to your jacket, or to your dress, or your skirt, or whatever it is you're making. If you're not too confident in top stitching, then use the same colour thread as your fabric. But if you are confident in sewing in a straight line, you could actually make a feature of the top stitching. You could do it in a really bold fabric, thread. Or what about one of the fancy stitches on your sewing machine? Really makes something a little bit different and unusual, particularly if you're using plain fabric. And actually top stitching over the handles like this is going to give the seams an extra little bit of strength. So if you are carrying anything in your bag that's quite weighty, it makes it stronger. Right, carry on around the side, we're almost there. Right, so you go out of the way, and my bag is just about finished. I'm going to double check for any little loose threads that may be poking out. I don't like to see those. Snip those off there. Now when I gather at the side here, remember it's only going to gather as far as those stitches that I put across the channels. So just tie that in a little knot at the side. Don't need to trim those, that's just the right length. And again on this side. And knot. And that's my bag finished. I hope you enjoy making yours.